"Where the hell are your papers? I'm asking you one more time, who are you?" the officer growled, tightening the cuffs. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors swung open. The highest-ranking commander from the Pentagon stepped in, his voice low and commanding, like a wartime order. "You just laid hands on someone our entire battalion once risked their lives to protect, and now you forced the entire system to bow its head. How many times have you stayed silent, thinking it's probably not that serious? How many times have you just watched, telling yourself it's none of my business?" Share this story as a reminder. Cruelty always begins with the bystander who turns away. The sun had not yet fully risen. The morning mist clung to the windows of old two-story white houses like a thin layer of cigarette smoke. Along the stone walkway threading through the quiet neighborhood, a middle-aged black man stood upright, eyes fixed on the distance where a small bus stop sat still, like a block of rotting wood under the damp air. He didn't wave for a ride or check the time. In his hand, a faded gray canvas bag was held tightly, as if it contained the only thing left untouched after years of moving. His old baseball cap was pulled low, almost to his eyebrows, hiding most of his expression, though the sharp line of his cheekbones hinted at someone not easily broken. Every movement he made carried a sense of careful calm, like someone who had been through places where rushing came at the cost of blood. The road remained empty. Aside from a few people walking their dogs and the sound of a car door locking from a nearby garage, no one paid him any attention. That changed when a patrol car slowly rolled past. Inside were two young white officers, one blond with a smirk etched into his face, the other tall and stiff, as if fresh out of the academy. They exchanged a glance, didn't turn on their lights, then suddenly swung the car around toward the bus stop. The engine revved louder than usual, as if to signal the start of a game. The car door flung open. Both officers stepped out with a swagger that was far too relaxed for the moment. The blond one spoke first, his mouth forming words with the casual rhythm of someone used to wielding authority as habit. He approached, leaning slightly as if trying to peek into the man's bag. "What are you doing here?" his voice rang out, light but with an echo that came from practice. "Got any papers? Or just waiting for a signal from your crew?" For a second, the air fell silent. The man lifted his chin slightly, acknowledging the question as his own. He showed no fear, but neither did he feign defiance. His face seemed to say he was staring at a pattern played out too many times to be interesting, and this time he had no intention of joining the performance. The second officer, still near the vehicle, spoke next, his tone colder, more direct. "I asked for your ID, you hear me? You've been standing here all morning and no one knows who you are." The man slowly lowered his canvas bag, without urgency. He unzipped it carefully, searched for something, then handed over a worn plastic card, its corners frayed. The blond officer glanced at it, raised an eyebrow, and skimmed the word "Veteran" embossed in faded print. His gaze dropped, then lifted again, no longer mocking but tinged with frustration, as if he hadn't yet found a better excuse. "That card's old," he muttered, voice sharp. "Doesn't prove anything." "It proves I served," the man replied, speaking for the first time. His voice was low, steady, and clear, like someone who knew every word he said would be questioned. The answer held no provocation, no submission either. That was what made the air heavier. The blond officer stepped closer, close enough now to catch the faint scent of sweat from the man's faded khaki shirt. "Served who? Now you're just standing here with no reason, no schedule, no witness. And near an elementary school." He snapped his fingers and turned to his partner. "Take him in. We've got some things to clear up." The second officer didn't ask anything. He walked over, preparing to cuff him. The man didn't resist. He simply stood there, as if this had happened before, many times, but this time his eyes didn't turn away. They stayed locked on the one who had given the order. The street stayed as quiet as before, but something had begun to shift. Not in the sounds, but in the stares, in the way old scars were left uncovered, and in the stance of one man, who didn't need to raise his voice to make others feel like they were the ones bowing down. He didn't answer right away. He slowly unzipped the front pocket of the canvas bag. Inside was not a wallet or a phone, but a worn military ID card. Edges frayed, surface scratched, nearly black. He held it out without meeting their eyes. Head slightly bowed, his voice low enough to be heard, but with no intention of explaining further. "I'm going to court." Just 5 words, short as chambered rounds. The sentence didn't heighten tension or ease the moment. It simply layered more silence onto the stillness, making both officers glance at each other as if unsure they had heard him right. The blond officer curled his lip first, a smile with no trace of humor. He took the ID card, flipped it back and forth, then slipped it into his own pocket deliberately. "Heading to court?" he repeated, drawing out the last syllable. "Even better. We'll help you get there faster." He made a signal, and the other officer immediately pulled out the cuffs. The man didn't move. His stance was neither defensive nor fully compliant, just standing upright, shoulders even, like a marker post long accustomed to weather. As the cuffs clamped around his wrists, his face showed no reaction. His arms dropped back without resistance, without submission, as if the act no longer carried any element of surprise. The sound of metal rang out sharply in the open air. Across the street, a woman pushing a stroller froze, instinctively tightening her grip on the child, though her eyes refused to meet the scene. An old man walking his dog picked up his pace in the opposite direction, glancing once before quickly looking away, as if he had witnessed something he was not meant to see. The blond officer lowered his voice, but kept it loud enough for those nearby to hear. A lesson for anyone who thinks they can loiter around a high-end neighborhood without getting noticed. He didn't call for backup. He personally escorted the man toward the patrol car, arm pressed against the suspect's elbow, as if he might strike without warning. The man followed silently, his pace unhurried, his steps unhurriedly steady for someone just treated like a criminal. As they passed the large window of a closed pastry shop, their reflection appeared. 3 figures caught in glass. The officer, tall, uniform crisp. The black man, hands cuffed behind him, shoulders slightly lowered. The younger officer, trailing behind, still awkward, like someone unsure whether he had done the right thing or the wrong one. The reflection lasted only seconds, but long enough that anyone who saw it by chance would not forget it. They opened the car door and pushed him into the back seat. No one asked another question. No one checked his reason for being in the neighborhood. It seemed to them that just taking him away was proof enough of their control over the situation. But none of them knew that just a few steps after the words, "I'm heading to court," things would begin to move far beyond their control. The engine started, a soft whoop of the siren followed, not out of urgency, but like a backhand across the face of every passerby, part warning, part show of force. But inside that car, the one person who needed no reminder at all was the man in cuffs. And with his posture straight, eyes fixed beyond the tinted glass, something about him made it clear. The vehicle might be headed in the right direction, but it was moving straight into a mistake. The patrol car stopped at the side entrance of the district station where unclear cases quietly slipped through without ever being recorded. The black man was taken inside without a word. He walked between the 2 officers like someone returning to a place where old footprints still lingered, though this time he wasn't on duty. The report was typed quickly. The young clerk kept his eyes on the screen, noting only 4 cold words under suspicious behavior, sense of abnormal conduct. No time, no details, no actions. Just a line to justify holding a man. The blond officer stood with arms crossed, eyes staring past the desk. He looked calm, but his jaw kept tightening. Under the faded light, even right and wrong blurred. A middle-aged officer, sleeves rolled, read the report and set it down without signing. "You sure about processing this one?" he asked, voice low. It wasn't judgment or advice, just a quiet warning. No criminal record, no alerts, no complaints. Just clean. He pulled up a file. "We didn't miss anything, it's just empty." "Could be using a fake name," the blond officer said quickly. "That card proves nothing. He was near a school." The senior officer glanced at him. "And your reason is sense of abnormal conduct?" "We're allowed to act on potential risk," he said. He didn't resist, barely spoke. The way he stood, looked, and carried that bag, it didn't feel right. Or, the officer added, leaning back, he just didn't look scared. Silence followed. The younger officer stood by the water cooler, watching the frosted glass of the holding room. The man's silhouette sat upright, shoulders steady. The officer signed the report but held the stamp. "No one forbids caution," he said, "but if this is about how someone looks in this neighborhood, it's not just one man." The words hung in the air like dry heat. The blond officer turned away, leaving the old ID card on the desk. Inside, the man said nothing, made no calls, showed no fear, but his eyes, fixed on a forgotten corner, still carried a cold clarity few here could grasp, and that, though never written down, made those used to control pause. "He was near a school," the lead officer repeated, voice thin. It wasn't a defense, just something to hold on to. No one openly objected, but the silence thickened into an uncomfortable layer of dust that settled over every administrative motion. The duty officer glanced at the screen again, where the empty data fields remained clearly visible. No security alerts, no prior record, no flagged behavior according to machine learning filters. Every click on the man's name returned the same valid result. Nothing justified holding him. And yet there he was, sitting behind the glass, wrists cuffed, as if unfamiliar presence alone had become the morning's greatest offense. A young office clerk set a tray of coffee on the desk, glanced over, and withdrew immediately. She didn't ask about the man in custody, but her averted eyes said enough. The unease was spreading. Something in the way he sat there, calm without trying to prove anything, was making more than a few people wonder whether they were following protocol or retreating into the shadow of a habit everyone silently accepted. Behind the glass, Booker, the name no one at the station had heard before, sat upright, eyes locked on a fixed point. The old ID card still lay on the table, its corner curled from moisture and time. No one asked him anything else. No water was offered. No lawyer was called. The door had closed like a matter of course. No loud slam, no excessive lock. But inside, someone was waiting, not for exoneration, but to see how a place built to represent authority would handle something that couldn't be managed by data. Dignity. No resistance, no requests, not a single word spoken since he entered the station. And that silence, instead of making him fade from memory, pulled attention toward him like a quiet gravitational field. A young officer passed by, almost looked in, then turned away. Something held him back. Not guilt, not even uncertainty about the man's crime, but the absence of fear or pleading in those eyes, so different from what he was used to seeing. In another corner, the duty officer gently closed a folder and set it beside the printer. He said nothing, but tapped the cover 3 times. A reflexive move from someone unwilling to let something sit idle. Moments later, he picked up the internal phone and called Central District ID verification. His voice was low, nearly a whisper. "I need a cross-trace. No rush, but as soon as you can." He didn't suspend the file, nor did he escalate it. It remained in that in-between state, not official, but not retractable. That was how large systems behaved when faced with something that didn't fit the usual pattern. In the holding room, there was no sound except the man's steady breathing. He wasn't asleep, and he didn't move much. But his eyes stayed open, fixed on the gray wall, where the hallway light cast a faint frame of illumination. Maybe he was remembering another room, one with the same kind of confinement. The same cold metal table, but located thousands of miles away, where silence wasn't a choice, but a condition for survival. And maybe now, that same silence was becoming a mirror, not for the one being held, but for the ones holding him, not because he was dangerous, but because he wasn't afraid. And in places where power feeds on fear, that has never been easy to accept. In the back intake room, a young officer checked the belongings of the man brought in earlier that morning. The gray canvas bag had frayed straps and a torn zipper, crudely stitched with thread. Wearing nylon gloves, not out of caution but routine, the officer opened it slowly, glancing toward the glass window where the man still sat, unmoving. Inside were a crumpled notebook, a broken-capped pen, and a neatly folded handkerchief. Flipping through the notebook revealed nothing meaningful, just scattered notes, symbols, and to-do lists with no clear timeline. No names, no phone numbers. It all felt like it belonged to someone used to leaving no trace. At the bottom of the bag was a small paper folded into quarters. It was ordinary stock, yellowed at the edges. The officer unfolded it without much expectation until one line of text made him pause. Delacroix, Courtroom B, I will be there. Just one sentence, no date, no recipient, but the name Delacroix, written in bold, slanted script, wasn't casual. It felt final, like a promise from someone certain that the courtroom would open, the person would arrive, and no conditions were needed to make it true. He glanced at the monitor, then back at the paper, reading the line again, slower this time. Delacroix. The name wasn't common, especially not with a location like Courtroom B. It didn't sound like a random hearing room. It suggested something deeper in the system, something absent from public schedules or internal bulletins. The officer hesitated, then folded the paper carefully and sealed it in a separate file sleeve. He marked a note on the intake form, forward to records unit for tracking. It was a routine step for potentially sensitive items, but this time it wasn't about suspicion. It was the sense of brushing against something far beyond a precinct's reach. As he stepped out, his eyes drifted again to the glass window. The man hadn't moved. His posture was steady, not tense, not watchful, but waiting for someone. Not for release, not for justice, but as if all this was just the beginning of a plan already set in motion, down to the hallway, the time, and even the look of the one handling his bag. The name Delacroix echoed again in the officer's mind, no longer with doubt, but as a quiet signal. The sentence, I will be there, still rested on that paper, yet rang clearest in the minds of those who read it, like maybe they were the ones being watched. The officer placed the sealed paper on the desk beside the intake file, then sat down but didn't start typing. The screen still showed an empty identity search. He reread the line, half expecting its meaning to shift, but it didn't. Delacroix, Courtroom B. I will be there. No exclamation. No date. No explanation. Cold in its simplicity. He picked up his phone and searched the name. Few results appeared, some out of detailed images, old reports. In them, Delacroix never spoke, only stood behind high-ranking commanders at briefings, never broadcast. One article called him the shadow behind covert campaigns, where maps were never printed. When he added Courtroom B, the search grew thin. But he knew one thing: when those two names appeared together, this was no longer a local matter. He mumbled, as if even he didn't quite believe what he was about to say. Delacroix, as in the news. The words slipped into the air without response, yet they made him straighten up, as if he'd just named something that wasn't meant to be spoken aloud. No one else in the room had heard it, but his hesitant glance toward the holding cell said enough. Whatever was happening this morning had moved beyond procedure and touched the thin line between power and public limits. He braced his hands on the desk, eyes still on the slip of paper, then turned toward the window. In the narrow hallway ahead, the black man still sat there, back straight, hands cuffed behind him. But the imbalance was becoming more visible by the minute. One man in custody, and an entire police station gauging its own reactions. He had seen plenty of detainees before. Some shouted, others begged. A few stayed quiet, but couldn't hide panic in their eyes. But never had anyone made him feel like he was the one being watched in return, the way this man simply sat and let everything else reveal itself. No resistance, no questions, no need to be understood. Back at the screen, he typed a few lines summarizing the contents of the note into the case file without naming the recipient, without mentioning Delacroix. He entered a single tag instead, file marked for elevated oversight, a code he had never once used since joining the force. That was how the system remembered things that had to be handled out of public sight. Before standing, he looked back once more. The note still lay there. The name Delacroix didn't glow, didn't carry a medal, didn't come with an order, but it did what dozens of internal alerts never had. It made a young man in uniform slow his breathing, double-check each step, and understand that sometimes a handwritten promise was enough to make the familiar order question where it stood in the story, and he chose not to file a formal report. Not to hide anything, but because he knew the ones who needed to know already did. The ones who needed to arrive would. As for him, this morning he had only been handed a small role, the one who opened the first signal to quietly show that this wasn't an arrest. It was the moment the system had come face to face with a silence it could not control. On the second floor of the station, in an unnamed data room, the glow from a monitor was the only thing cutting through the thick air. The officer handling identity records typed with the speed of habit, not attention. He processed hundreds of names a month, from drifters to corporate complaints. But this morning, entering the details of the man brought in from the northern neighborhood, his fingers slowed without him noticing. The letters appeared. Surname, given name, birth year, address from the report, and the worn ID number found in the man's bag. He ran the search. The wheels spun for a few seconds before returning the usual no data line, except this time every field came back blank. Not even a parking ticket, a missed credit payment, or any trace from a system every American resident touches within 6 months. Defense, civil security, and federal health. Every network returned nothing. No outage, no system failure, just nothing. He sat up, checked each digit, retyped everything, switched formats, ran cross-indexed searches with backup intel data. Still blank. He launched the layered trace interface, used for false identities or encrypted profiles, but the result was just a clean frame with the message, "No matching records. Identity key has no previous registry." He'd seen that line before, usually when probing deep agency cases or foreign nationals off the grid. He tapped the pen on the desk. Only the hum of the servers and the fan broke the silence. No hospital logs, no immunization records, no rental files. It was like the man had never lived anywhere, never used a bank, never had a doctor. What bothered him wasn't the lack of data, it was how perfect the absence was. Real people leave messes, misspelled names, outdated addresses, incomplete transfers. Here, there were no loose ends. He pulled up the initial file again, clicked Exception Verification. A prompt asked for a reason. He typed, "No data found across all strata. Possible federal anonymity or restricted clearance," then paused and added, "Recommend continued detainment, pending higher directive. Sent." Before leaving, he stared at the screen once more, as if a late reply might come, but only that quiet blue field stayed, flat and silent like the system's way of saying no. He stepped out without reporting to anyone. One question lingered in his mind. Who lives in this country for nearly half a century without leaving even a scratch on a public record? And if he really exists beyond all systems, how long can this place even claim the authority to hold him? In the break room at the end of the hallway, usually reserved for night shift officers or admin staff stopping in before heading out, a few people stood in small clusters, coffee cups in hand, voices lowered to a near whisper. No one openly discussed the morning's incident, but the furtive glances toward the newly updated notice board, where the man's name appeared in a brief holding report, said enough about the invisible weight settling over the building. A salt and pepper-haired man, a specialist in physical evidence handling, stepped out of the archive room and leaned quietly against the doorframe. He didn't join the conversation, but when a younger officer mentioned finding nothing in the system, he gave a faint chuckle, almost muttering to himself, "The ones with nothing to trace, they're the ones to watch." It didn't sound like fear or warning, just a conclusion drawn from decades of experience, from handling every type of suspect, fugitives, government aliases, memory loss cases erasing their own past. But this man showed no signs of hiding. Everything fit too smoothly, too quietly, just enough to unsettle anyone used to working with data, as if every piece of his identity had been swept clean from every system layer, leaving no hooks to follow. While rumors crept quietly through the halls, Booker still sat at the end of the corridor in the holding room. The metal chair had no backrest. The desk in front of him held nothing but a blank intake folder and a pen without ink, left over from the last shift. His cuffed wrists rested gently on his thighs, not limp, not strained. His posture was near perfect. not in submission, but in the way someone holds their body when they're used to being ready. Fluorescent light cut across one side of his face, catching the edge of his jaw, chin angled toward the bare gray wall in front of him. No memos, no patrol schedule, no agency insignia. A crack near the baseboard showed signs of long-term moisture damage, but Booker didn't seem to notice. He looked at it like he was reading something no one else could see. No darting glances, no drifting focus. That gaze wasn't sharp like a threat, nor vacant like confusion. It pointed somewhere far off, not in space, but in memory. The security officer walked past the hallway window, eyes catching the moment Booker tilted his head slightly, shifting his gaze from that fixed point to a lower angle. The movement meant nothing by itself, yet it made the officer pause 2 seconds longer than usual before walking on. The door to the room remained closed, not double-locked. No one stood direct watch, but no one came closer than necessary either. Everyone on shift understood this wasn't a case to handle like any other, not because they were ordered, but because the silence itself had created a boundary, one that made seasoned professionals tread more carefully. Inside the holding room, Booker remained still, but the space around him seemed to recede, making room for a strange tension no one in the building could quite name, a presence that didn't demand acknowledgement, yet made the entire system pause and examine its own reason for being. That feeling seeped into every room, every step, every half-spoken exchange, turning an ordinary morning into something quietly beginning to shift. Not because anyone raised their voice, but because, without planning, everyone had started to listen. The next morning, the Central District Courthouse grew crowded early. Reporters gathered in small groups near the main steps, mostly waiting for a high-profile financial trial involving a chain of investment funds under fraud investigation. The defendants' names had made headlines all week, and photos of lawyers stepping out of a black SUV were already part of the media routine. Barricades had gone up the day before, and security staff in suits with earpieces controlled each entrance. Inside, courtrooms were lit, chairs cleaned, and files stacked in order. A group of officers escorted detainees through a side passage, avoiding the press. They moved in formation, quiet, exchanging only brief radio messages. Among them was one man not listed on the original docket. He entered last, not in prison uniform, but still wearing yesterday's light shirt and plain trousers. His eyes met no one's. Though cuffed, his stride was steady. One of the officers noticed but said nothing. The main hallway on the 3rd floor led to courtroom 2, where the financial case would be heard. The black stone corridor lined with built-in wooden benches held those summoned, dressed formally, speaking in short phrases while avoiding eye contact. Court technicians checked sound systems, recording equipment, and remote cameras. Everything followed protocol for a trial under media watch. Booker walked that hallway unnoticed. No one knew his name. He moved through a space designed to deliver justice, but one that often overlooked people considered unimportant. Yet, with each step, silence seemed to stretch thinner, not because anyone recognized him, but because something unseen walked beside him into that courtroom. When officers stopped Booker at the door of courtroom 2, a young court clerk quickly stepped out, signaling them to wait. He whispered to the senior security officer, who checked his phone. Seconds later, the wooden door opened, off schedule. The officer nodded and Booker was led inside, past the gallery to the detainee's bench. On the bench above, Judge Lawrence, originally set to preside over the financial trial, was already present. He held no case file, only looked toward the gallery now settling. The door closed, and before anyone could question it, the gavel struck. "The scheduled case is postponed," he announced, calm but firm. "We have a matter requiring honorable intervention." No one immediately understood what he was talking about. A few attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. The clerk's hand trembled slightly as they typed, slower than usual. Postponing a major trial for sudden reasons wasn't unheard of, but rarely had it been announced with the phrase, honor intervention, a term that had all but vanished from modern judicial records. On the right bench, Booker had been uncuffed. He remained seated, eyes fixed on the judge's stand. His gaze held no demand, no request for clarity, just a quiet confirmation that events were now unfolding exactly as he had expected. No speech was necessary, no explanation required, just presence, as he had once written. And now the trial had shifted, not by public schedule, but by the pace of someone the system thought it had forgotten, yet was now being forced to yield to. Seated in the gallery reserved for law enforcement, the blond officer sat upright, arms crossed as he typically did during internal briefings. But today his gaze had changed. It no longer carried the confidence seen yesterday when he ordered a man cuffed in the street. Now it wavered between unease and confusion, not out of fear of punishment, but because he was facing a reality no one had trained him to handle. When the judge declared the financial case suspended, no one in the room grasped it at first. Then the auxiliary screen behind the bench lit up, showing a file not listed on the day's docket. The case title appeared in bold, uppercase letters: Intervention and Violation of Honor, tied to secured military status. Below the title was a list of involved parties. In the second position, the officer's full name, badge ID, and current rank appeared on screen. He froze, knees weak. For a moment, he couldn't hear the judge's voice or see the pale overhead lights. Everything collapsed into two words he knew but never imagined would follow his name: under investigation. The first reaction wasn't fear, it was the jarring flip of the board, too fast, too precise, leaving no room for protest. Yesterday, he stood in control, arresting someone he deemed suspicious. He had filed a report, signed it, cited behavioral irregularities. Now he was the one being asked to explain how that feeling justified holding a veteran overnight, cuffing him, treating him like a criminal without any evidence beyond skin color and the location of a bus stop. He turned to find his partner. The other officer avoided his eyes. The report officer kept writing, pretending not to notice. The isolation crawled up his spine, joint by joint. He clenched his left wrist, still marked from yesterday's glove, but tension brought no clarity. On the bench, the judge continued reading: an arrest without formal charges, incomplete administrative steps, and failure to notify senior oversight after the system returned no record. Each line struck like a gavel, cracking the structure he once believed was made of steel. For the first time, he realized the silence of the man in custody wasn't passive. It had been a counterattack without words, because the one under scrutiny now wasn't that man. It was those who believed they had the final say. Outside the chamber, a soft knock echoed, and a man in a senior military uniform entered behind the last row. No one introduced him. No signal was given. Yet the entire room straightened. Whispers stopped. Pens froze mid-air. The blond officer, just moments after seeing his name under investigation, spun around and met the calm gaze of the man who had just entered. In that instant, he understood. Control was no longer his, not because of a mistake, but because some people need no voice to force a room to reevaluate its sense of justice. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if an apology would still mean anything, because things had started to slip beyond justification into a current where silence could write its indictment. A soft knock at the rear door echoed just as the judge finished speaking. No one paid much attention at first, as it was usually for court staff or administrative personnel. But the man who entered that morning wasn't someone familiar with courthouse halls. He wore a formal Navy uniform, deep blue with silver medals on both sides of his collar. His jacket was pressed flat, and the Defense Department's sash under his shoulder glinted under the lights. Yet what truly halted the room wasn't the uniform, but the way he walked, measured, deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of an irreversible order. He moved past the benches and the prosecution table without needing direction, stopping a few feet from the detained man. Without looking around or speaking, he raised his right hand in a formal military salute, straight, firm, and entirely solemn. The gesture held for 3 full breaths, unwavering, needing no introduction. It happened too fast for anyone to react. The courtroom's sound seemed vacuumed out, as whispers, rustling papers, and tapping pens fell silent at once. Those taking notes froze, The audio technician paused the recording. Some looked to the judge for guidance, but he remained still, eyes fixed on the man who had just entered. The blond officer, who had just seen his name in the investigation file, instinctively stepped back. He didn't know why. No one gave an order, no one shouted, but something in that silent salute, something unspoken, made his legs seek distance. Not just physically, but in awareness. From the bench, Booker lifted his head. He didn't rise or shift expression, but his gaze moved from the cracked wall to the man in uniform. They looked at each other. No nod, no words exchanged, nothing was needed. Their connection wasn't verbal. It was etched in unseen scars, in decisions made when no one was watching. Someone in the gallery reached for their phone to capture their phone, but not to hide it, but quickly motioned them down. Not to hide it, but because this wasn't meant to be captured. It was meant to be felt. A quiet reversal that no accusation could match. Like that single salute in open court. The man in uniform lowered his hand, stepped back, and turned to the judge. Still no formal introduction, but from Judge Lawrence's expression, it was clear. This man wasn't an ordinary witness, and the salute wasn't mere protocol. It was a declaration that the cuffed man, the one the system failed to identify, was someone whose worth exceeded the reach of a local precinct. Someone worth a public salute from a four-star general. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, not from sound, but from the realization that they were witnessing something not found in any procedure manual. And in the center of that moment, Booker remained still. His eyes didn't ask to be heard, because what he once stood for had just been acknowledged, without a single word of defense. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the man who had just lowered his hand after the salute. The silence that came before had built just enough tension for any words spoken after to carry weight, and he knew that. Without haste, without hesitation, he stepped forward to the microphone beside the judge's bench, already live, and looked directly across the room. "That man is Staff Sergeant Booker, Sniper, United States Marsof." His voice rang clear. No amplification needed. One sentence, but it peeled back the surface of speculation, scrutiny, and the silence of authority. No one in the room dared interrupt. Some titles, when spoken in a setting like this, are enough to make every procedural safeguard take a step back, and Marsof was not a name that typically surfaced in a civilian courtroom. He stood upright, eyes still fixed on Booker, then continued. "He once pulled me and my entire squad out of a siege in Coast Province. 14 men, 5 hours, nearly out of ammunition, one exit left. He opened that path himself." Inside the courtroom, pens stopped moving. A young lawyer dropped a stack of documents and didn't bend to retrieve them. A court clerk leaned forward, as if doubting what had just been said. Marsof stood for Marine Special Operations Forces, an elite unit under the U.S. Marine Corps, operating at the highest levels of classified command and rarely listed in any administrative record. Having a member of that force appear before a civilian court was unprecedented. Judge Lawrence tilted forward slightly, his expression still composed but his brows now slowly tightening. The presence of General Delacroix, along with that statement, forced even his prior certainties to the side. He nodded, allowing him to proceed. "After that mission, I recommended Booker for promotion, but his record was never properly archived. The entire operation was classified. Men like him are trained to leave no trace, even when they survive." That final sentence made the blond officer lower his gaze. He had his hands braced on his thighs, shoulders still tense, but his fingers were beginning to shake. What he had once considered suspicion, standard procedure, now stood exposed. He had treated a man who once shielded 14 lives with his body as if he were a nameless suspect, because he didn't look like the kind of person who waited for buses in that part of town. Delacroix looked back at Booker, the same gaze but now with something close to regret. He knew he hadn't been there that night when the soldier was left in the street, unprotected, and he also knew that standing here today wouldn't erase that. But he came to say what Booker himself had never spoken aloud, that if silence once saved a team from death, then today It was forcing an entire system to face the mask it wore. He turned to the judge and gave a slight nod. "I'm not here to ask for an exemption. I'm here to clarify the truth. And if the law still means anything, then the man who defended this country in the shadows deserves to be seen in broad daylight." There was no applause, but in that silence every look in the room had shifted, and in the center of it all the man just formally named remained, seated, eyes on the bench, showing no emotion, no satisfaction, because to him a title was something you carry, not something you use to reclaim what should never have been taken. But this time he had been acknowledged, in the right place, at the right moment, and by the only person entitled to do so. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't move at all. Sitting in a courtroom silenced by a series of staggering revelations, the man with cuffed hands gave no reaction to the apology issued from the highest bench in the room. But his silence, his upright posture, still shoulders, and unwavering gaze created a pressure that held the entire chamber in a heavy fog of shame. Judge Lawrence swallowed hard, fingertips brushing the file before him like searching for steady breath. He had presided over countless trials, heard every type of plea, and seen guilt take on many forms. But never before had he faced someone in restraints, calm, unaccusing, neither asking nor resisting, who left the court more defenseless than any plaintiff or defendant he had known. He spoke, voice even, trying to strike the right weight. "We apologize for the procedural misunderstanding. This should never happen to any citizen, especially one who has served the nation." The statement met protocol, but it arrived too late, not because it was wrong, but because everyone knew it should never have been necessary. The term procedural misunderstanding could not mask what everyone had seen: judgment based on skin color and authority masked as protocol. In the back rows, those who once chanted support for law enforcement held back the blue signs, now said nothing. Their eyes avoided the sunlight pouring through the tall glass window, as if afraid that what had just happened confirmed what they once dismissed as exaggeration. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse, her other hand gripping the armrest so tightly her nails nearly broke skin. The officer who first cuffed Booker stepped half a pace back, eyes locked on the polished wood floor. He once believed he followed procedure, that his instincts were valid. But watching this man, who did not retaliate, did not defend himself, did not demand respect, left him feeling exposed. In the thick silence, General Delacroix stood beside the man who had once saved him. Despite the uniform and golden stars, he knew he now stood before a truth larger than rank. Some silences don't shout, but force entire systems to reckon with themselves. The judge glanced at the police chief seated beside him, signaling him to speak, but the man only nodded faintly and lowered his gaze. No one wanted to explain anything now, because every word would sound like an excuse. In that moment, Judge Lawrence understood the apology hadn't been for Booker, because Booker didn't need it. It was for himself and all those who had sat in that chair, believing justice was always on their side. But justice, as the soldier had just shown them, doesn't come from power. It comes from how one holds on to dignity when everything else has been stripped away. Finally, the judge lowered his eyes and said softly, "The court will recess to review the full procedure and all information related to this case." Inside the silent room, only Booker remained motionless, his gaze steady as if he knew, sometimes, silence is the only voice a man who's been through war still carries, forcing an entire society to ask itself what made them believe they had the right to judge someone based on a single look. Delacroix didn't wait for the session to formally recess. His voice cut through the stalled air, sharp enough to pull every gaze back to him. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said, eyes fixed on the bench. "It's reflex. And that's what needs to be judged today." Judge Lawrence paused, then slowly set his pen down. He didn't object, but clearly reflex had no place in legal frameworks. Couldn't be measured by administrative metrics. It was a word balanced between humanity and prejudice, and when spoken by a man who once commanded over 1,000 troops, it carried weight beyond argument. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. but no one laughed. Because the look in Delacroix's eyes when he said it wasn't accusatory, it demanded self-reflection. He wasn't asking for sympathy or orchestrating drama to defend the soldier. He was drawing a line between the legal system and the unconscious reactions society had grown too used to, judging by skin color, predicting behavior by appearance, and asserting power before understanding people. "I've seen that look before," Delacroix went on, his voice slower now. "When a fresh recruit accidentally aimed a rifle at an unarmed child. He didn't mean to. He acted on what had been imprinted in his head by a string of images. And by the time he realized the mistake, it was already too late." The room held still. No name was given, but everyone knew. He was speaking of death, not by weapon, but by bias. We call these things errors, misjudgments. But if it's always the same kind of person, the same kind of act, repeating over the years, it's no longer an accident. It's a reflex, and reflexes can be retrained or passed on. The judge leaned back, hands clasped. He had handled charges big and small, sentenced some to death and acquitted others, but never had he heard a charge not directed at a person, but at the entire foundation of a system's perception. Delacroix turned to the law enforcement section, where the officer who had cuffed Booker was still standing, shoulders locked as if pinned by an unseen weight. "Do you remember what you said when you stopped him in the street?" Delacroix asked, not expecting a reply. "You didn't ask his name. You didn't ask if he needed help. The first thing out of your mouth was, 'God ID?' That simple question, once standard procedure, now echoed like a verdict, not because of the words, but because of the context. It was that context that served as a sentence with no jury required. Booker remained still, his gaze unchanged, but the air around him had shifted. He was not a victim, not someone needing rescue. He was a mirror, and everyone in the room was being forced to look. Delacroix drew in a breath, then lowered his voice. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't need commendation. But if we walk out of this room today thinking this was an isolated incident, then we're going to repeat it with the next person." Behind him, a broadcast reporter rested his hand on the camera, his fingers trembling slightly as he prepared to take notes. He didn't know what headline to write, because no one in the room had been convicted, but the entire society had just been called out. And at the bench, for the first time in decades of rulings, Judge Lawrence exhaled softly, not to end the session, but to acknowledge that this time he too had just learned a lesson no law school had ever taught. At the witness stand, an older man in a dark gray suit with a pin from a high-level military force stood when called. His posture was upright, silver hair neatly combed, his gaze steady under the lights and lenses. After confirming his identity, he cleared his throat and spoke, each word striking through the worn layers of courtroom formality like live ammunition. "Staff Sergeant Booker's records were classified under top security clearance," he said, voice firm and steady, without notes, "because the missions he served in were never documented publicly, and their nature prevented storage in civilian systems. But that does not mean he did not exist." Some in the courtroom exchanged glances, unsettled by the word "did not exist." A man once absent from every record now stood confirmed by a former military commander with rare public respect. Judge Lawrence lowered his head to take notes, but the pen paused mid-stroke, as if even he needed time to absorb what had just been said. "I once led a joint forces unit in East Africa," the man continued, eyes on the cuffed figure. "And on a night we were surrounded from four sides, Booker was the only one willing to cross hostile ground to locate our reinforcements. No maps, no satellite feed, just instinct and resolve, from someone who knew survival wasn't measured by time, but by how one keeps promises to their team." No one interrupted. On the police side, a few officers looked down, not because they were told to, but because they now felt they'd stood on the wrong side of history. Just yesterday, they believed they were right. The testimony carried no bitterness, no plea for sympathy. It was true, and in each truth was a crack forming in the polished shell of authority. "We understood his worth," the man said, lifting his hand slightly, as if sketching a memory still vivid, "not from scores, not from medals, but from how he made people stop thinking about their own lives and start thinking of each other. Delacroix gave a faint nod, affirming the words of his former comrade. Booker remained still, but now his gaze held not just strength, but a silent gratitude expressed not in words, but in the posture he had never once broken since entering the courtroom. The old man clasped his hands behind his back and finished, "If a man like that, who gave nearly everything to defend his country, can be treated as a threat just for standing on a street corner at dawn, then it's not Booker who needs to be investigated, it's the system." That sentence ended his testimony, but opened a door that could not be closed. Judge Lawrence remained seated, pen still resting. No one in the room spoke. But change had already begun, not through emotion, but through eyes that now saw Booker as someone to learn from, not watch over. And in that brief moment, inside a courtroom built on authority, there was a soldier's silence and the voice of one who once followed him that stirred the entire room awake. As silence draped over the court, the clerk reached for a small brown envelope from a sealed file. The letter was not typed, not printed in cold official language. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, and slightly shaky, as if the writer had weighed each line before letting it fall onto paper. The clerk looked to the judge for permission, then read aloud, each word sinking deeply into those present. "He doesn't need to be remembered, but we need to remember how we once made him disappear." The air fell still, like smoke fading through the rafters. No one moved. The words were plain, yet piercing, like someone peeling back the tired layers of a system, letting in a light that, however faint, still found a way through. Him once defended this country in places no one dared to go, carried out missions that even I, as commanding officer, could neither disclose nor justify. When he came back, he didn't ask for medals, didn't demand thanks. He only asked to live as an ordinary citizen. The clerk's voice dropped at the final word, pausing for a short breath. At the back of the room, a middle-aged woman placed her hand gently over her chest, not from emotion, but as a reflex, a shield. The judge leaned forward, his eyes no longer fixed on documents, but locked on the man sitting calmly in handcuffs. The next line struck not as a plea, but as an accusation aimed at those still in uniform. "We didn't erase his name on purpose, but silence, assumptions, and a system of indifferent procedures turned someone who once stood as a marker of survival into a perceived threat." Everyone seemed to brace for a final verdict. But the last line didn't stir anger or blame. It was only an admission, and for that reason, even harder to deny. If there's anything to be corrected today, it's how we see a person, not through a file, but through the scars they carry on behalf of those who never came back. As the clerk folded the letter and placed it on the bench, the stillness in the courtroom held like the pause before a verdict. But unlike those early moments when silence came from confusion, this stillness carried the weight of understanding. Something had shifted off its old axis. The officer seated in the front row began to lower his head. No one told him to. Sweat slid from his temple down his neck, soaking into his collar like a quiet warning. No one looked at him with excuses. Those who once shared his rank now turned away in silence, not to disown him, but because they too had realized they'd stayed silent for too long. When people no longer know what to say, it's no longer a personal failure. It's the clearest sign of a culture built on hardened self-defense. Delacroix remained upright, needing no further emphasis. Booker, hands cuffed, stayed still, eyes locked on the place that once symbolized justice. But this time his presence was no longer a mystery. He had been seen in handwritten words, in the testimony of a former commander, and in the first glance that dared to look in the right direction. At that moment, no one in the room spoke, but what needed to be heard had already been said. And that voice, from a soldier long erased from official systems, was the one that finally made the entire system listen to itself. Under the pale white lights of the courtroom, the tension from earlier testimonies still hung in the air. A woman in the gallery slowly stood. She wore a light blouse, hair tied back neatly, the kind of person who rarely stood in spotlights. But her voice didn't tremble. It carried the tone of someone who had thought long and hard before choosing to speak. "My name is Marlene. I work at the post office near the main square," she said, eyes fixed on the witness stand. "A few months ago, on my way to the bus stop, I passed a pizza shop and noticed something strange." The clerk began typing. Attention shifted to her. There was a tall black man wearing an old coat and a knit cap. He didn't do anything, just stood there looking at the menu. But minutes later, 2 police officers came in. They didn't ask much. One grabbed his arm, the other yanked his wallet from his pocket. She paused, glancing toward the table where Staff Sergeant Booker sat silently. "I saw them push him outside, forced him to the ground, cuffed him in front of the customers. People watched. No one recorded it. No one said anything. Neither did I." Her words fell into the space, still clinging to the belief that justice always follows procedure. Marlene took a breath, as if to steady herself for an unscripted confession. "I kept walking, like everyone else, but I remember exactly how it felt. I wondered if that man had been my father, my brother, someone I knew, would I still have walked away?" A defense lawyer paused with his pen. The judge didn't interrupt, just tilted his head slightly. Marlene spoke louder. "I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here because if we keep staying silent, someone will always be erased from the truth." In the back rows, a few people lowered their heads, maybe from shame, maybe recalling their moment, one they might have handled differently. She stepped half a pace closer to the stand, unprompted. "I can't say for sure if the man that day was Mr. Booker, but I remember his eyes. Eyes of someone not expecting to be defended but still looking around as if to remind us all that being seen and believed is a right." The young prosecutor looked up, then quickly down, as if jolted awake. Among all the evidence, statements, and titles, this may have been the first time someone spoke truly for human dignity, not just for the law. Delacroix, seated near the front, folded his arms and closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging a truth that had just been placed in the right spot. No rebuttal, no exhibit needed, just a sentence, "I should have spoken." And sometimes that alone begins real change. Booker didn't turn to look at her. His posture remained the same, but in the angled light through the high windows, something subtle shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, certainly not satisfaction, just silent recognition for someone who had finally chosen not to look away again. When Marlene returned to her seat, the person beside her gave a slight nod. No one clapped, no praise was given, but something shifted, thoughts stirred, and self-reflection began. It was the kind of impact no technical testimony or physical evidence could trigger. A witness had spoken about silence, so that this time silence could no longer be excused. Under the pale light from the high window, her testimony was typed, checked line by line before submission. Clark's couldn't share it publicly, but the electronic copy quietly spread within the system. At first, only legal staff read it. Then it circulated with a single note, worth reading, especially the middle. It traveled across inboxes like a whisper. Everyone understood without needing to name. There were no dramatic headlines, no capital letters spelling out discrimination or abuse, just a plain transcript where a citizen described a moment she chose silence. That was what made people pause. Not emotion, but recognition. It didn't accuse, didn't instruct. It simply held up a mirror. In another state, a veteran officer read the line, "I can't be sure it was Booker, but I remember the eyes," and printed it. He placed it on his desk. When a recruit reported in, he just pointed, "Read it, then sign." The recruit, expecting dry doctrine, read the story and quietly signed, no pressure, just a sense of having seen himself in it. At a suburban police academy, a young instructor handed it out without slides or scenarios. A cadet asked if it was official. She said, "It doesn't have to be. It just has to be true." The discussion was quiet. When class ended, no one got up right away, and in rooms where rules ruled everything, that transcript, soft and unforced, became something else entirely. Not a symbol, but a quiet check-in with one's conscience. Not law, not policy, but a reminder that silence, too, is a choice, and every choice leaves a mark. When the gavel struck to end the hearing, The room remained frozen in silence. The man in the decorated military uniform who had once raised his hand in salute before the entire court now walked slowly toward the bench where Booker sat. Whispering rippled through the crowd like water under pressure, but Delacroix paid no mind. His steps were steady, eyes locked on Booker, and when he reached him, he removed his hat and saluted, not as a soldier to a superior, but as a man honoring someone who had given a quiet life to protect others. No ceremonial sound followed. No one reached for their phone. The moment passed in silence, but something fractured deep inside many who witnessed it. Delacroix said nothing. His slight bow spoke every word of gratitude. It was also his way of saying this wasn't just the correction of a mistake. It was a reckoning. A system forced to look directly at the darkness it once tried to cover. Booker remained silent, but this time he looked away from the wall and toward Delacroix, nodding, not to return the gesture, but to confirm it. No more explanations were needed. What had to be protected was safe. What had to be revealed now stood in full light. The jurors stood from their seats, some slower than others. A few wiped their eyes, others sat motionless, feeling they had just witnessed something greater than all their legal training. One juror, a university professor, whispered, "What shook me wasn't his past. It was how he stayed silent." The person next to her replied, "Because he knew, at some point, he wouldn't need to prove anything anymore." The officers in the courtroom were told to maintain order, but most didn't move. Some avoided Delacroix's eyes. Others looked again at Booker, as if trying to reconcile him with the man they once held, the man with a canvas bag, quiet and unresponsive. The named Staff Sergeant Booker now had a face, a history, a depth that stretched far beyond any booking form. The officer who had once cuffed him no longer stood upright. He stepped back into the corner of the room, gripping his waistband like it was the last solid thing left. Whatever apology he had rehearsed stuck in his throat. He had believed his actions were procedural, defensible, but what broke him wasn't a lawyer's rebuttal or a supervisor's rebuke. It was a salute outside protocol, delivered by someone with more rank than anyone in the room, who still bowed his head to a man once labeled nothing to verify. In the hallway outside, no cameras waited, but many passing by turned to watch the two men, one in uniform, one still cuffed. No one spoke. No one blocked their path. It was as if something invisible opened in the crowd, and all felt it should not be disturbed. And then they walked out of the courthouse with no applause, no headlines. But something had shifted. It was not about reputation, not about victory. It was about awareness that sometimes the strongest thing is not in what someone says, but in who chooses to lower their head before whom. And in that silence, what remained was not a verdict, but a promise that there would be fewer times someone is misjudged simply for standing in the wrong place. Under the cold, dim light of the courthouse hallway, where footsteps and doors faded into silence, Booker tilted his head slightly, his eyes shifting away from Delacroix's face before dropping gently. No one noticed rejection, nor did anyone sense contempt, but those who had served long in the military understood. It was a gesture outside any formal protocol, and it didn't need to be one. It was not a nod of gratitude, nor denial, but a quiet recognition that respect only matters when directed at the right place. Delacroix remained still, his eyes fixed on Booker. A long pause followed, not out of awkwardness, but as if both men were giving the past a moment to pass through for the last time. Then he spoke, slow and loud enough for the room to hear. "We don't need medals. We need to walk without being stopped." The air tightened. No one moved. The words weren't only for Booker. They were a quiet but undeniable indictment of every system that maintains control through suspicion. A court clerk dropped a pen, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. But no one turned. Every eye stayed on the man who had just spoken. With 4 stars and decades of command, Delacroix didn't need to say anything more to quiet the room. But he chose to, and said what should have been said long before Booker was handcuffed, before people believed procedural instinct could excuse everything. The judge said nothing, no one from the bench added a word. The session ended, but no one left immediately, as if everyone needed a pause, not just to process with logic, but with feeling, a sense that they had just witnessed a shift, not in law, but in how people might look at one another again. From the gallery, a woman stood and placed her hand over her chest, not from emotion, but to hold something back. She didn't know Booker, had never heard his name until today, but the way he stayed quiet, the way he walked through every stair without speaking, reminded her of her father, a soldier who had returned in silence and never spoke of what he did. For the first time, she understood why. Booker's cuffs were removed, but he did not rush out. He stood tall, shoulders even, eyes steady, not scanning the room, but turning with deliberate steps. Each step said one thing: not everyone detained needs to be rescued. Some saved themselves by never surrendering their calm to injustice. Delacroix didn't turn either. He followed, but kept his distance, not out of rank, but out of respect. He knew Booker didn't need an escort. A man who once guarded an entire unit through a sniper scope didn't need guarding now. He only wanted to be there as proof that a truth once forgotten had now been put back in place. Outside the courthouse, a breeze moved through the slanted row of flags near the entrance. There were no cameras, no statements, and no crowd. But those who happened to see two men leave, one in a senior uniform, the other in a wrinkled gray shirt, found themselves standing straighter, not because they were told to, but because their bodies seemed to adjust on instinct in the presence of something right. No longer doubt, but learning who should be saluted first. Under the soft afternoon light, a small side door of the courthouse creaked open. No hurried footsteps, no cameras, no crowd of reporters or curious onlookers. Just one man walked out quietly, wearing a faded shirt and carrying the same canvas bag he had brought in from the start. His movements were calm, not like someone who had just escaped trouble, nor someone who had won anything. If no one knew the story, they'd never guess that the system had just been forced to bow before a truth it couldn't deny. Booker didn't head for the front gate. He didn't look around, didn't stop, didn't check a phone. The arm once used to steady a sniper rifle now carried a bag like it was part of a daily ritual, and those legs, once crossing lands of blood and sand, now walked away from the courthouse without leaving a trace. He gave no signals, no nods, yet what people couldn't look away from was the calm in his steps, a calm that can't be faked, only carried by someone who has seen the edges of loss, honor, and forgiveness. In the press room, staff scrambled to rewrite the statement. His name wasn't allowed in the headline, his photo couldn't be used, and anything tied to military service had to be cleared by the Pentagon. Down the hallway, a few journalists waited, hoping he'd exit through the front so they could catch a glimpse. But when they learned he'd left through the side door, silence blanketed the room like a thick curtain. A young reporter sighed, turned off her recorder, and said quietly, "I guess this is the kind of hero who doesn't need a mic." At the same time, across the city, an elderly man flipped through old files. He was a retired internal affairs officer, long familiar with cases buried in silence. But this time, he couldn't stay still. He remembered Booker's name from a note once tucked away in a forgotten drawer. Back then, the man who wrote it had said, "He won't need thanks. Just don't turn him into another system error." As for Booker, he walked several blocks and stopped at a small cafe with no signboard. The staff didn't ask questions, just handed him a black coffee like always. He sat outside, not hiding, not retreating, but his eyes were different, no longer guarded like when he was in custody, nor wary like when he entered the courtroom. They belonged to someone who had once been buried and got up without needing help. The passing cars, the laughter from nearby tables, the breeze tapping the awning, all blended like the trial had never happened that morning. But in that air, something had changed. People hadn't yet named it and didn't know how to react. But Booker's presence, brief, silent, was enough to slow the city down, not because he tried to make an impact, but because he didn't have to. And that, to many, was the clearest proof that sometimes The strongest thing isn't a voice, but a presence that doesn't need to be explained. The old rhythm of Booker's boots echoed across the concrete when a quiet voice called out from behind. A young officer hurried forward, breath uneven, eyes filled with a mix of guilt and urgency. "You're going to sue, right?" "You have to, don't you?" The question spilled out like reflex, not rehearsed, but not uncalled for either. It rose in the quiet corridor behind the courthouse, where most people pass through without stopping to consider what lies deeper than a verdict. Booker paused, not turning back right away, as if weighing each word before he spoke. When he did, his eyes held no anger or pain. They simply looked straight at the young officer, not accusing, not pleading, not lecturing. "I've done enough. Have you?" The words weren't loud, but they dropped like a heavy stone in still water. The ripples didn't stir the surface. They revealed the sky reflected in it, the kind of reflection people often avoid. The officer stood still, unable to respond. He had seen everything. From the moment Booker was cuffed in the street to when General Delacroix entered the courtroom with that silent salute. He hadn't acted, hadn't stopped it. He wasn't complicit, but he'd never spoken up. And now, that question, simple, direct, and utterly reversed, placed a weight on him no chain of command, no protocol, no excuse could lift. Booker turned away again, walking calmly, as if he had always known this moment would come. But the officer stayed frozen, his gaze beginning to turn inward. Maybe he would write a report, maybe file a complaint. Maybe resign. Or maybe, next time, he simply wouldn't stay silent. Whatever came next, this brief exchange had planted something no sentence or training manual could, a discomfort deep enough to begin change. Elsewhere, a senior legal advisor was crossing out lines in an internal file. On the last page, a red note read, "No recommendation to prosecute. Prioritize review of non-legal criteria in threat identification." The dry wording was the result of someone walking through a door without being welcomed, without a dramatic win, but forcing a system to rewrite its language. Booker didn't know, or didn't need to know, that his silence was shaping decisions in places he'd never go. He just kept walking, past a small park where kids played soccer under the fading sun. A young black boy stood near the curb, watching him, as if trying to recognize something familiar. There were no slogans on Booker's shirt, no marks to show he was once a sniper, but that quiet presence, that lack of declaration, made the boy look a moment longer than usual. Eventually, Booker disappeared down the block, but the young officer still stood in place. Wind brushed his sleeves, carrying a question he hadn't answered. He didn't know why he called out to Booker. Maybe it was the unease of watching someone the system had dismissed walk with a steadiness that shifted an entire courtroom. Or maybe it was the first time he'd seen someone who didn't need to prove anything, yet made him, the one who held authority, question what he was protecting. "Have you?" The question still rang in his head like a small bell. And maybe, only when he found a real answer, would justice stop being just a word in a textbook. At the state police headquarters, something unusual was happening. Something not written into any official protocol. Files began arriving from smaller precincts, without any formal request or directive. Each carried the same spirit, a reckoning. The reports didn't begin with, "as instructed," but with words like, "I used to believe I was unbiased until..." They arrived at odd hours, early mornings, end of shifts, mid-patrol, like their writers could no longer hold back what needed saying. In the records office, the administrator paused when dozens of emails appeared with the same subject line, "Personal evaluation." No response needed. One in particular made him stop working to read it in full. It came from a veteran officer with over 20 years of spotless service. "I didn't break the law," he wrote. "I just let bias do the job for me. And now I see that's more dangerous than procedural error." The letter listed moments left out of official reports. A stop for a nervous driver, a bag check for avoiding eye contact, a delayed response because the caller's voice wasn't clear. Each detail seemed small alone, but together they formed what the writer called a familiar path of avoiding personal accountability. At a police academy, a young instructor was using these reflections in class, not to shame, but to show future officers that justice doesn't begin with knowing the law. It begins with knowing when we're hiding behind it. A student asked, "What do we do once we realize?" The instructor answered, "Next time, ask one more question. Look a little longer. Wait one more second." That's the reflex we need to relearn. The reflections spread quietly across the system like living documents. They weren't in textbooks, nor were they quoted in annual reports, but they were printed, folded, and kept in coat pockets by those who believed training needed to be rewritten, not with statutes, but with unprompted self-reflection. In another district, a precinct chief called an urgent meeting. No one was disciplined, but he asked everyone to name a moment they judged someone not by actions, but by appearance or context. No one stayed silent. Each story had the same thread. I thought I was doing the right thing, but that assumption, repeated over the years, had built a system that operated without needing anyone to steer it. In Delacroix's small office, a copy of an old handwritten letter hung beside an uncaptioned photo frame. "We once let people disappear because we didn't look closely enough," the letter read. That line now opened a training session on professional instinct, not starting with rules, but with the question, who was the last person you doubted, and why? Booker's story had ended in court, but for every person who witnessed it, read the records, or quietly sent in an unsigned report, that wave was not over. It didn't need headlines. It only needed enough people to begin. Inside a small auditorium at the Federal Police Academy, rows of chairs were neatly arranged, the lighting dim, the atmosphere closer to a quiet classroom than a formal hearing. But precisely because there was no podium, no microphone, what was shared carried even more weight. It was an unofficial session where young officers were invited to speak about moments when they chose silence. Not out of agreement or approval, but from fear that they would be next if they spoke up. One man stood first, his hands slightly trembling, eyes still haunted by a recent scene. "I remember that man's face," he said, "and I remember seeing something wrong." He paused, swallowed, and continued, "I didn't do anything. I didn't raise my hand, didn't signal, didn't ask, because I thought if I stepped in, the whole group would turn on me." The room stayed silent. His voice was low, but each word hit hard in corners of the mind that many had kept shut. An older instructor in the back didn't interrupt. He simply lowered his head, as if acknowledging that the feeling being shared was one he, too, had once known. "We're trained to act when something feels off," the young officer added, "but no one told me what to do when that something came from someone wearing the same uniform." No one spoke, but at the end of the row a cadet scribbled something into their notebook. Maybe it was a note, maybe a question still unspoken. A female officer stood next. She described the feeling of standing in a moral minefield, knowing that one step toward justice could turn her into a target from within. She said, "I didn't want to be called a traitor, but now I know betrayal is leaving the innocent to be crushed." The stories kept coming, not as accusations, but as pieces of memory, never voiced. No one was asked to apologize. No one was told to fix anything. This wasn't an evaluation. It was the first time many realized that what haunted them wasn't what had gone wrong, but the silence that followed when they couldn't forget. A visiting sociology professor stood and said, "Silence doesn't create the bad, but it allows the wrong to linger long enough to feel normal." He looked around the room. When the first person tells what they failed to do, that's not weakness. That's a call for a generation that stands up before proof is required. After the session, the Academy's board decided to make this format part of every training cycle, not as a curriculum, but as a reminder. Some scars only heal when spoken aloud, and some lessons don't come from classrooms, but from staring directly at the shame that's never been named. Elsewhere on campus, a message appeared on the internal bulletin board. It was handwritten, "I stood still, but from today, I won't stand alone." No signature, no date, but everyone who read it understood. A shift was happening, not in the system, but in individuals. Because sometimes what makes a profession more humane isn't removing the wrong ones, but helping those who hesitate find the courage to stand on the right side before they're told to. In an old lecture hall at the Maryland State Law School, fluorescent lights cast down on young faces flipping through notebooks, searching for an unfamiliar question not found in textbooks. Who is Miles Booker? On the board, the name of the seminar was written in chalk by hand. No one stood to recount heroic deeds. No one began with how many lives Booker had saved or how many missions he had completed. Everyone sat in a circle like a fall philosophy class, quiet and sincere. A second-year student spoke up without introducing himself. We knew of him from an unnamed news story, but what stayed with me wasn't what he did. It was the look on his face as he left the courtroom. Calm, no resentment, not asking anyone to validate him. Pens scribbled softly on paper. Someone near the door nodded, as if confirming that what they heard wasn't an event, but a state of being that needed to be understood more deeply. Another student added, I used to think respect required something, titles, degrees, or at least a loud voice. But he didn't speak up, didn't argue, didn't explain, and still, the courtroom adjusted itself. She paused, glanced at her notebook, and continued, softer this time. Maybe what makes someone worth listening to isn't how they speak, but how they've lived before they ever needed to. An hour passed without anyone checking the time. The session wasn't meant for conclusions, but for listening and self-reflection. What does society's reaction to someone like Booker say about itself? A criminal law student shared, "We're taught about elements of crime, about the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. But what happened to Booker made me realize sometimes people are suspected just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a skin tone that others don't like." A professor who had been standing quietly in the back finally stepped forward. He didn't talk about the case. Instead, he asked, "How many of you would put your name on a petition demanding the system reevaluate how it responds when no charges are filed?" A few hands went up, slowly, not to show off, but as a private commitment. On the projector, a single photo appeared. Booker walking down the courthouse hallway, not looking at anyone, hands still cuffed, posture unbowed. A student from the media group stared at the image for a while, then said, "We often think it takes a crowd to make change, but sometimes one person walking through is enough to make society pause and look harder." The session ended without applause. People stood, packed their things, and left in silence. On the board, the chalk words were still visible. One person stayed behind, wiped the board clean, except for the name Miles Booker. He stared at it for a moment, then added a single line beneath in slanted handwriting. "You don't need to greet anyone to be respected." In the hallway, a few students stopped to read the new sentence. No one commented, they just read it and walked on, as if they understood that what mattered wasn't who Miles Booker was, but why someone like him could remain composed when an entire society once stayed silent in the face of injustice. And that composure, more than any medal, was the greatest lesson of that day. 1 week later, a student edited the transcript into a long article for the school journal's Law and Society column. The piece didn't begin with Booker's name, but with a question. What is justice if it only arrives after someone proves they are innocent? The sentence was bolded and placed between two wide blank margins, so readers couldn't scroll past it without asking themselves what should have been obvious. The pages that followed compiled reflections, handwritten notes, and an excerpt from the military commander's letter, once read aloud in court. Each passage recalled a specific image, the exchange of glances between Booker and the young officer, the moment the Navy admiral saluted, and Booker's succinct answer when asked whether he intended to sue. In the conclusion, the writer, a final-year student, stated, "Justice doesn't begin in the courtroom nor end with a verdict. It begins the moment a person doesn't need to shout their identity, show papers, or call in favors, and still causes the system to examine itself." There was no exclamation point, no italics. The sentence stood like a fact, plain, undeniable. The article was shared among faculty and within days landed on the desks of federal law school policy advisors. Meanwhile, at a high school in the southern part of the state, a civics and social ethics teacher used footage from Booker's hearing as class material. She paused the clip as Booker walked down the hallway, then asked her students, "Do you see anyone walking behind him?" One student answered that no one was following him. The teacher smiled, nodded, and said, "Right, because sometimes the person who goes first walks alone until others realize they must follow, not because they're told to, but because they can't stay silent any longer." Soon after, the phrase "system reflex" became the title of a training program rolled out in 3 major police departments. Officers were asked to submit short essays about times they acted on instinct rather than facts. One officer wrote, "I once pulled someone over because he stared at me too long in the rearview mirror. I called it professional intuition. Now I see it might have just been exhaustion." His account was used as a teaching point, not to blame, but to show that self-correction is the first step in correcting the system. Elsewhere in the city, a group of activists launched the Booker Stance campaign, using an image of him in court as their emblem. They printed posters, but didn't distribute them widely. Instead, they mailed copies directly to school libraries, community centers, and police precincts open to reform. Below the image was one line, "What will you do when facing someone who needs no proof, yet still changes how you see the world?" When the student's article was published in a statewide paper, comments poured in, but no one asked who Booker was, where he came from, or what he was doing now. They just described the shock of seeing someone stay silent through the hearing, reclaiming no dignity with words, but letting it surface through how others saw him. One older reader wrote, "I've lived over 60 years thinking justice belonged to the courts, but Booker taught me sometimes it begins when someone stands there, not angry, not pleading, and makes the whole system rethink itself." The final line of the article, now quoted in many civic forums, wasn't a declaration but a quiet reminder. When someone needs no proof, yet forces the system to reconsider, that's when justice begins. No one remembers who wrote the line, but everyone remembers the man who walked out of court in silence. And that, perhaps, is the closest thing to dignity. In the months following the Booker case, it wasn't politicians but the heads of security academies who were the first to take concrete action. A federal police training school in a western state quietly introduced a pilot course that did not fall under technical or tactical training. The course title was written plainly on the academic bulletin board, "Pause reflex minus reflex, begin observation." That simple phrase marked one of the quietest yet most determined shifts in law enforcement training philosophy since the 1980s. The first class didn't begin with lectures or theory. The instructor, a former internal affairs inspector, simply played the video of Booker being escorted down the courthouse hallway, then sat in silence while students watched. After a few quiet minutes, he asked, "Did anyone observe any dangerous behavior?" A few students raised their hands, analyzing Booker's gestures and demeanor, searching for something off to hold on to. The instructor nodded without challenging them. Then he asked, "Now, if I told you that man had once been honored for saving dozens of lives, would your perspective change?" The room fell silent again, but this time with a different kind of silence, the silence of confronting a boundary they had never named before. The course content focused on distinguishing professional reflex from unconscious bias. One student was invited to recount a personal stop-and-search encounter. He admitted that during a night patrol, he stopped someone just for wearing a hoodie and walking slowly near a convenience store. "At the time, I thought I was preventing a risk," he said, "but looking back, I'm not sure I would have done the same if that person had been a veteran or someone just off work." Confessions like that were encouraged, not for judgment, but to reveal how reflexes can disguise themselves in the clothing of professional duty. In another session, students were instructed to watch a busy street surveillance clip and mark individuals they felt might require additional observation. The results weren't graded, but were compared with real data. The person most frequently flagged was a retired engineer who took walks every afternoon, while the one no one noticed was an experienced pickpocket. The lesson wasn't about who was wrong, but about how the truth can often run completely counter to what we feel is right. After each class, students were asked to keep reflective journals. One female student wrote, "I used to take pride in reacting quickly, but maybe reactions shouldn't come before observation." Another quoted a line from the Booker trial, "Not a misunderstanding, a reflex," and added, "If I once believed in professional instinct, I now understand that instinct can be trained wrong and needs to be corrected like any other skill." The Academy Board initially intended to pilot the course for 6 months, but after positive feedback from both students and instructors, they made it a required subject for second-year cadets. An internal report noted, "This course doesn't slow down the students' response times. It teaches them to choose the right moment to react, and when to wait 2 more seconds to look more carefully. Those 2 seconds, as one instructor put it at a professional conference, can save not just a life, but the honor of the person in uniform." News of the course quickly spread to neighboring states. Several civilian police academies began requesting access to their content and teaching methods. One eastern state even incorporated parts of the curriculum into accelerated training for highway patrol units. No one called it a major reform, but everyone agreed Booker had become the catalyst for something long felt necessary, yet never given a clear starting point. And the course, Pause, Reflex, Begin Observation, gave them that reason, not through outrage or rebellion, but through an undeniable example of the consequences of failing to look closer. The instructor walked into the classroom dressed plainly, without a uniform or title. A few students quietly recognized her face, the woman who appeared in the video from the Miles Booker trial. She didn't carry a syllabus or academic material, just laid a single sheet of paper on the desk, folded many times, its edges creased from being opened over and over in the past few weeks. When she introduced herself, it wasn't by name but with a story, and the classroom shifted. Not a lecture, but a reverse interrogation. "I don't teach law," she began, her voice steady and slow. "I'm not here to explain clauses or procedures. I'm here because I still carry a question I don't have an answer to. If I had spoken up that day, would Miles have been handcuffed?" No one replied. Third-year students, trained in tactical response scenarios, were not prepared to answer that, because it wasn't about protocol. It was aimed at something tests can't score, a moral response in a moment with no orders given. She recalled the events of that day, without drama or blame. She simply described the look in Booker's eyes as he was stopped outside the pizza shop, how she as a passerby had seen everything yet stayed away. "I stood 3 meters away. I saw them push his shoulder, saw the cuffs come out. I could have said something, but I stayed quiet, thinking it was someone else's job. I chose to walk on." She paused, not to dramatize, but to let the weight of what she didn't do settle in the room. After finishing, she held up the worn paper and unfolded it in front of the class. It was the handwritten statement she gave in court, the one that led to the broader investigation. "I wrote it because I can't redo that moment," she said, "but you all still have many moments ahead." A student asked, "If you could go back, are you sure you'd intervene?" She smiled, answering not with certainty but with truth. "I'm not sure, but if I never told the story, my silence would always be the right thing." There were no group exercises or case simulations. The instructor simply asked each student to write a short piece. "When was the last time you chose silence?" Some hesitated, others began writing immediately, as if they'd been waiting for permission to let something out. She walked around the room, pausing at each desk, not reading a word, only nodding. The atmosphere wasn't tense, just awake, as if something long absent from the curriculum had quietly taken root. Before leaving, she offered no summary, no advice. She only left one final sentence, written in even strokes on the whiteboard. "Sometimes justice doesn't need a hero. It needs someone ordinary who dares to stop." When she stepped out, no one called her back. No one clapped, but a faculty member from the behavioral science unit quietly noted, "Unscheduled class, but more impact than 3 emergency response modules combined." That woman didn't need to teach to shift perspective. She only had to ask the right question, the one the entire field must learn to answer. If I had stood up, would he still have had to bow his head? Inside a high-security auditorium at the Pentagon, General Delacroix stepped up to the podium without an introduction. The room wasn't filled with officers, but each person present had the authority to reshape an entire system. He stood silently for a few seconds at the microphone, scanning the familiar faces he had seen in decades of strategic meetings, then began with a single sentence that brought the entire room to stillness. "We lost a soldier, not in battle, but to a reflex of public authority." He didn't need to say the name. That name had echoed all week, from courtrooms to internal bulletins, from professional briefings to closed-door ethics discussions. Miles Booker, elite sniper, leader of hostage rescue missions in the Middle East, had been arrested in peacetime over a misread expression and a reflex never re-examined. Delacroix didn't hide his frustration, but he made no speeches, no accusations. He asked one question: are we willing to accept a justice system based on feelings rather than facts? He recounted the morning he received a handwritten note: "Delacroix, Court B, I'll be there." No signature, no explanation. But he recognized the handwriting and knew who had written it. He knew Booker wouldn't ask for help. He wouldn't demand anything. His decision to appear in court was not to plead his case, but to force those in power to face their actions. And Booker's silence, Delacroix said, was the very thing that made the entire system stop. "We train them for missions most civilians can't even imagine," he said, "yet we fail to shield them from the biases embedded in the society they serve." He admitted he had once supported the strict secrecy surrounding special operations units. He understood the need for confidentiality. But he asked again, if that secrecy causes them to be doubted in their own country, is it truly protection anymore? Delacroix's words didn't blame the police force, but neither did they excuse the rationalizations. He emphasized, "I don't care what he was wearing or where he stood. I care about one thing. He once risked his life to save my entire squad. And here he was stopped because of his skin color and a bag without a brand name." He didn't have to raise his voice to make an impact. The story, as he told it, carried the weight of systemic failure. The meeting ended without rebuttal. Some people took notes. Some stayed silent longer than usual, but everyone understood that this speech wouldn't end in that room. It would become material for officer training. It would be quoted in the internal analysis, and more importantly, it would be a reminder that in an age where all data can be spun, a single wrong reflex can erase a right person. Before leaving the podium, Delacroix offered one final sentence. Not for the press, not for the public, it was for those around the table. Those who had the authority to rewrite how a force operates. If we learn nothing from this, then preserving the military's honor is just a slogan, and if that's all we have left, then we're no longer fit to lead anyone. General Delacroix remained at the front, eyes fixed on the officer who had just asked a question. He didn't respond immediately. A long pause followed, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. He looked at the young officer, then slowly nodded. "That is the right question," he said, "and that's why I'm proposing we amend the confidentiality clause not just to protect service members, but to set a precedent that we can no longer rank human worth by medals or titles." He continued, explaining why amending the clause had become urgent. Under the current policy, the identities of veterans from special units are encrypted to protect them from being targeted, but that encryption, as he pointed out, inadvertently renders them non-existent in the eyes of the civilian system. When subject to administrative checks, they have no matching records. When suspected, they have no way to verify their identity without breaching confidentiality. And when mistaken, like Booker, they stand in a circle of doubt with no system trigger capable of speaking for them. General Delacroix turned to the representative from the Department of Justice and clarified his proposal. He wasn't demanding that all military data be exposed. He only asked for an internal relay mechanism, one that allows a special unit to verify a soldier's identity in emergencies without revealing the entirety of their operations. If we can deploy biometric verification for high-risk criminals, he said, then surely we can do the same to protect those who once risked their lives for this country. After his statement, the young officer from earlier remained still, but this time his gaze had softened. He gave a small nod, as if accepting something he hadn't considered before. Another member of the council, likely the oldest in the room, spoke slowly. I used to believe justice would correct itself with time, but after Booker's case I realized, if no one does what's right while they still hold power, then justice is just a pretty word in a textbook. The meeting moved into open debate, drawing a range of opinions. Some argued that altering confidentiality rules would compromise intelligence work. Others sided with Delacroix, saying that if someone risked their life on the front line for the nation owed them at least a system that wouldn't turn ignorance into a threat. Yet all arguments circled back to one truth. The current system was never designed to recognize human worth without ID cards, titles, or achievement records. Delacroix didn't dismiss the concerns. He emphasized only one point. I'm not asking anyone to assume that veterans are always right. I'm only asking that when someone gets pulled into a holding cell on a regular day, we should have a way to know who they once were, not to excuse them, but to prevent repeating the mistake. In the final moments of the meeting, he paused again, no longer looking at the people in the room, but towards something broader. And for civilians, he said, echoing the young officer's words, we must be clear. They don't need medals to be respected. They need a system that knows when to stop and look closer, because when Booker stayed silent, it was civilians who spoke up. And to me, that is the most lasting value of a free society. That evening, the town square wasn't packed, and there was no stage or loudspeakers, but each flickering candle formed a quiet line of awakening. People came not because of a specific call. They found their way, each bringing a candle, some prepared in advance, others bought hastily nearby. In every hand was a small piece of white paper, neatly tied around the candle with thread or clear tape. On each paper, there was only one line. No names, no dates, no hashtags or slogans. That simple sentence read like a prayer for those once judged by a glance because of their skin, their walk, or their silence in a noisy place, so that no one has to stand still in the street and be treated like a threat. The line repeated on every candle as if the whole community had silently agreed without speaking. No speeches were made, no one wore uniforms or matching clothes. They came with silence as a form of resistance. In the soft light, some bowed their heads, some sat on the curb, and children asked, "Who were we lighting candles for?" The adults didn't answer with names, but with words like, "For someone who was once jailed because no one recognized who he was," or "For the right things that should have come sooner." In a quiet corner of the square, a group of students stood in a circle. No one recorded, no one streamed. They quietly passed around matchsticks, lighting their candles and handing the flame to the next person. One girl whispered, "If someone had stopped to ask that day, maybe he wouldn't have gone through all of it alone." A classmate nodded. No one interrupted. No one tried to take the spotlight. Everyone seemed to understand that tonight wasn't for retelling what happened, but for affirming that it should never happen again. On a nearby bench, an elderly couple sat with candles in hand. The husband said he had served as a Marine and had seen silence mistaken for danger too many times. But this time, he said, he came not for an old comrade, but for his grandson, growing up in a city where even quiet could be judged. His wife nodded, her hand tightening around the candle as if holding on to an unspoken promise. No one gave a speech, but every gesture became a declaration. A small child picked up a stranger's candle that had gone out and relit it. A man pulled out a pen and added a message to his candle's paper, so my son won't have to learn to slow down just to avoid suspicion. Each handwritten note made the vigil something that defied scale or publicity. Her voice was steady, not trembling. "I don't know what war is," she read, eyes fixed on the paper, "but I know he shouldn't have been arrested just for standing still." The words paused for a few seconds, not from forgetfulness, but as if to let each syllable settle between the sounds of wind and a community's breath. No one clapped. They just looked at her, as if they had just witnessed something too simple to praise, but too real to ignore. The girl bowed, then walked back to her mother, who had held her hand throughout the vigil. The mother said nothing, only placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, like an unspoken thank you. A few reporters lifted their cameras but lowered them again under the organizer's gaze. Tonight, no one held exclusive rights to tell what just happened. The child's presence shifted the gathering from ritual to something deeper, a quiet transition from emotion to action. Some began sharing when they first realized what unconscious judgment felt like. An elderly man recalled being 19, stopped outside a movie theater because he didn't look like someone who belonged. A young woman whispered that her brother had once been kicked out of a bubble tea shop for wearing a headscarf. These fragments never made headlines or lawsuits, but tonight they resurfaced as part of a collective image, where Miles Booker was no longer an exception, but a symbol. Not far away, a group of young people started writing on fresh slips of paper. No names, just moments that had been made unnecessarily strange. Stopped 5 times for reading a book at the bus terminal. Denied a pen in class because someone thought I might be in a gang. Wore a suit walking home and got stopped for looking off. They pasted the notes along the square's outer fence, forming a wall of stories society had long avoided. The girl's sentence wasn't printed on banners, but it became the night's center, not a statement but a truth from someone too young to have been trained in self-defense. An adult nearby quietly copied it into a notebook, then looked up and told a friend, "We built a world where a child understands that standing still could get you arrested." No one argued. There was no need. As night fell deeper, families began to leave. Children holding candles, now extinguished but still clutching their notes, silent promises carried home. One child asked, "What do we do next time someone gets stopped?" The mother hesitated, then said, "We step up, or if we can't yet, at least don't turn away." The child nodded slowly, absorbing a lesson not found in any book. The girl who read still sat nearby, next to her mother, staring at the notes on the fence. Someone handed her a marker. After a long pause, she wrote, "If I were born with the skin color people fear, can I still walk the shortest way home from school?" When she put the marker down, a stranger copied the line into their phone and sent it to friends with the message, "This isn't poetry, this is a consequence." And because of that, the vigil did not end. It shifted. It became whispered conversations across the city, in diners, on social media, in classrooms reopening the next morning. Justice, from that moment, was no longer a distant concept tied to courts and lawyers. It began with a child's honest sentence and how the adults chose not to let it fade. The decision was issued on a Tuesday morning via a single internal email sent to all personnel in the county police department. No press conference, no front-page headline in the city paper. In the document, the name of Sergeant Phillips, the officer who once handcuffed Booker at the courthouse gate, was mentioned only once, with the note, "Permanently dismissed for gross ethical misconduct." No one spoke up in his defense. The police union posted nothing. This silence did not come from fear of public backlash, but seemed more like consensus. Inside headquarters, Phillips' desk was cleared by the admin staff by late afternoon. The small cactus he kept next to his monitor was moved to the personal effects storage room, next to a faded family photo bleached by morning sunlight. No co-workers checked in or expressed regret. They just walked by quietly, each with their reaction, some sighing in relief, some frowning at the sudden absence, and others pretending not to notice. The dismissal happened quickly, but not as a way to avoid accountability. On the contrary, it signaled that the system had begun to recognize certain mistakes couldn't be erased with apologies. In the following days, senior officers attended mandatory internal training, not based on reports, but on real-time scenario simulations. Booker's name wasn't spoken, but everyone understood what had set this new threshold for public patience. In the city's southern district, a young officer spoke up during a patrol team meeting. "This is the first time we've seen someone dismissed not for politics, but because they no longer represent what law enforcement is supposed to mean." No one objected. The team leader, who once taught that being a cop doesn't mean being always right, but always ready to make it right, just nodded. At a courthouse cafe, a group of public employees talked over coffee. One mentioned Phillips had been reported more than once for arbitrary ID checks, but the internal files always ended with no grounds for action. This time, that line was gone. No one credited media exposure or military pressure. People just called it the inevitable outcome. More notably, those who once stayed silent began to shift. A public relations officer posted on her page, "A press release has no value if it defends the indefensible. Sometimes staying silent is the only right call." The post went viral overnight, not because it was angry, but because readers sensed someone inside the system had finally stopped excusing it. Phillips gave no response. He left the city 3 days after the decision, leaving a blank forwarding address in his personnel file. A neighbor said his car was moved early, before rush hour. No one came to see him off. All that remained was a scrap of paper wedged in the doorframe, handwritten, "I used to think I was doing the right thing." The letter was never made public, but the building's security guard took it home and, weeks later, taped it to his refrigerator as a reminder. Not to blame, but to remember that public systems do not run on detachment. They run on accountability, even when the person responsible for the mistake is no longer around to hear the verdict. And in that silence, a critical shift took place. For the first time, a misconduct was acknowledged, not because it caused outrage, but because it could no longer be ignored. The report spanned 13 pages, mostly extracted from internal monitoring records, police station cameras, periodic psychological assessments, and team meeting notes. At first glance, it looked like any other administrative report, cold, full of technical terms, and neatly segmented, but on the final page, a handwritten note stood out. No need for harsh punishment, but it must be addressed directly. The words weren't about retribution, but about confronting what law enforcement often avoids, going to the root of a misstep, the reflex. The Bias Behavior Evaluation Unit wasn't widely known. This team handled repeated cases of irregular or biased conduct during duty, typically kept under wraps to protect the institutional reputation. But Sergeant Phillips' case set a precedent. He was reassigned directly to the unit after a public incident, bypassing the usual soft-step procedures. The decision caused more stir in law enforcement circles than a permanent suspension would have, because it forced people to confront what had long been a taboo: the behavioral nervous system of those who carry weapons. Inside the unit, specialists didn't focus on surface-level actions. They tracked variations in eye contact when interacting with different racial groups. They reviewed behavioral patterns in unsupervised moments. Above all, they examined reactions that happened before logic could intervene, like gripping a weapon without any sign of threat, or the shift in tone when approaching a black man on the street. Phillips entered the room not as a defendant, but as living evidence of what happens when small signs go unchecked. The initial sessions had no transcripts. A psychologist asked one question. "When you first saw Booker, what was the first thought in your mind?" Phillips didn't answer immediately, but 2 days later he wrote down, "I thought he might be dangerous because he was too quiet." Next to that sentence, the psychologist wrote in red ink, "Bias shows up before behavior. We need to retrain the moment judgment begins." The evaluations weren't released to the public, but their impact spread across the field. Internal training programs began to use Phillips' case as a key example. not as a form of condemnation, but as a reminder that what isn't faced will return in another form. A former patrol supervisor said, "Disciplinary action calms public reaction. Behavioral correction prevents future damage." That quote has since been repeated in reform workshops. After 4 weeks, Phillips's file was moved to long-term monitoring. He was no longer on active duty and no longer had access to operational tools. More significantly, his name was no longer tied to any leadership role. He became a mandatory participant in third-party training programs without authority over others. To some, this was a mild conclusion, but to those harmed by the wrong reflexes of the powerful, it marked the start of a different kind of justice, one not about punishment, but about correcting the core of what causes harm. The comment in the report, once just a personal note, became a phrase echoed in internal meetings. No need to make it loud, but it must be made right. From there, the system stopped avoiding and began cleaning up the corners it had never lit. A 240-page manuscript sat on the editor's desk, its placeholder cover marked simply, "Booker, the soldier who didn't resist." The author, once a war correspondent, had spent nearly 8 months tracing Booker's life, not through military files, but from street corners he once stood on, a convenience store where he quietly returned extra change, and classrooms where people recalled how his gaze changed how they asked questions. The manuscript wasn't about valor. It told how Booker stayed silent when he could have screamed, and how that silence reshaped a courtroom, an academy, and an entire law enforcement culture. But when sent to a publisher, the response came quicker than hoped. "We reviewed the material. While reflective and well-written, the subject lacks the prominence to attract today's market." The reply arrived via email. No meeting, no follow-up. The sole reason emphasized was public recognition, something Booker never saw. The author wasn't surprised. He had seen many like Booker, caught between sacrifice and erasure. What unsettled him was how the publishing system, which claimed to amplify critical thought, refused to tell the story of a man even the system had once admitted it failed. Not prominent enough meant no viral clip, no trending post, no headline quote, just the quiet presence of a man who sparked change but was never named at the right time. He didn't revise the manuscript or seek another publisher. Instead, he pulled excerpts and printed them into small self-published booklets. Each one had 12 pages, a plain cover, and no numbers. He left them in local libraries, independent bookstores, and sometimes mailed them to professors, lecturers, and criminal justice students he believed would care. He didn't expect reimbursement. He only wanted someone to read and remember. One early excerpt that spread widely described Booker standing before a mirror, wiping dirt from his face after a mission still sealed in records. No sweeping memory, no dramatic inner voice, just a simple note. He didn't wash his hands first, he cleaned the mirror, as if what he needed to see couldn't be himself, but the undistorted reflection of someone who came through war without losing the straightness of his gaze. The words weren't meant to move readers. Yet many law students copied them onto their notebooks because they saw something classrooms rarely teach: how to face oneself after a decision that felt right. Gradually, the small prints circulated. A professor in Oregon used them to open a public ethics class. A student in North Carolina cited them in a thesis. A youth group in Chicago hosted a community reading where no one debated, they just read in silence and rewrote the lines that struck them most. The book, once dismissed as not prominent enough, found space in places the market overlooked, where silence spoke loudest. To the author, this was enough. At a small local library gathering, he said, "I don't need anyone to remember my name, but if a single line makes someone hesitate before they act, then Booker's been remembered right." That was all he hoped for, a memory not seeking rankings but able to redefine what it means to matter. The manuscript had no official publisher, no ISB, and no scholarly foreword or flashy design. It was uploaded as a free PDF with a short note. "You won't find drama here. Just truths long looked away from. No push to go viral, no donation link." The author asked only one thing: if you reach the last page, Ask why you didn't read this sooner. It spread first among those furthest from the corridors of power. A high school teacher in Missouri printed excerpts for her civics class. She didn't assign a report, just left one question. If you were Booker, what would you do when held not for your actions but for your presence? In the corner, one student folded the pages and wrote on their notebook cover, "Justice isn't for whoever yells loudest." In a training center for formerly incarcerated adults, a life skills coach chose an excerpt about Booker's look at the officer who handcuffed him. No anger, no collapse. He asked the room, how does someone betrayed by their institution not carry hate? No one answered immediately. But that day, one student stayed behind to borrow the full printout. At the community library on the east side of the city, where the budget barely covers reference books, the elderly librarian chose to print each chapter and place them in a separate drawer. When someone borrowed them, he didn't take names, he only asked, "Is there someone in your life who was wronged and you stayed silent?" For him, lending the manuscript wasn't about finishing it, it was about getting people to start reading themselves. A group of criminal justice students in Oregon held a series of open readings. Not academic, not debates over right or wrong. Each person picked a passage that made them pause the longest, then shared a personal memory it stirred. At one session, a Latino student said he used to fear wearing a suit to job interviews, afraid it would make him look suspicious. Another student quietly mentioned her father had been frisked on the street while walking his child to school. These personal stories began to find one another not under stage lights, but in a space where no one had to prove they were heard enough to be heard. The manuscript's author never spoke publicly about its ripple effect. He declined every interview request, posted nothing on social media. He quietly updated the printed pages whenever someone wrote to say the manuscript helped them ask questions instead of accepting bias as part of the job. Once, when asked why he didn't publish it for wider reach, he simply answered, "Because justice shouldn't have a cover price, and the people who need to hear this most are usually the ones who can't afford to buy it." The manuscript, with no official title and no spokesperson, became part of an underground ecosystem, where those who once stayed silent started finding their voice again by mentioning Booker, not as a symbol, but as a lesson not yet fully learned. And maybe, when a manuscript can spread without promotion, when truth is no longer measured by engagement metrics, the thing the system once tried hardest to avoid can finally begin to be named. At the bus stop on the east side of the city, the man stood beside the schedule post, a faded backpack over one shoulder, short-cropped hair, and steady eyes. He didn't look at anyone, nor did he avoid them. His posture didn't invite conversation, but it didn't build walls either. Those around him, if they looked long enough, might notice something familiar, something once seen in news segments, panel talks, or buried between the lines of an unpublished manuscript. The bus arrived later than usual, its weight rumbling softly through the pavement. No one rushed. In the quiet, a young officer approached, uniform still crisp, hand resting beside his thigh as trained. He looked at the man for a few seconds, then tilted his head upward. The breeze stirred the shrubs by the curb. After a moment of thought, the young officer exhaled and said something that didn't come from any manual. "It's a beautiful day." The man didn't answer right away, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement. His eyes held no challenge, no chill, just a subtle weighing of what that sentence carried. Hesitation, respect, or maybe the test of a new beginning. The officer didn't step closer. He didn't check the bag, didn't glance at the worn-down clothing. This wasn't a check. It was a quiet test, not for the one being looked at, but for the one learning how to look. A minute passed. The bus stopped. The doors hissed open. The man stepped forward without turning back, but paused a fraction of a second before tapping his card. A small nod, barely there, like a thank you with no sound. The officer watched, eyes no longer cautious but reflective, as if learning what it meant for a simple act to matter on a day like this. Nothing from that day ended up on camera. No viral clip, no hashtag, no chant. But in the young officer's memory, perhaps what stayed most was how silence replaced command, and a casual greeting replaced suspicion. It wasn't a major event, but it was the kind of moment that reminds a system that some changes begin with something simple. When a person chooses to see without casting a shadow from the past. The man wore no badge, no uniform, no card pinned to his chest to remind others who he once was. He stood at the bus stop like anyone else, hand resting on the strap of a worn fabric bag, not as a defense, but as if holding on to a memory long left unspoken. His face gave away nothing except a passing smile when the young officer spoke. It wasn't a confirmation or denial. It was a sign that he heard and accepted the greeting for what it was. A small signal of change just beginning. No one asked further. No one was sure if it was Rooker or just someone who resembled him, but that no longer seemed to matter. In that quiet, free of tension or fear, there was no wariness, just presence, a plain, steady kind, as if his being there needed no permission. When the bus arrived, he boarded like any other citizen, without asking or waiting to be invited. The driver was older, eyes flicking quickly from the rearview mirror back to the road. He said nothing, gave no sign. To him, the man was just another rider. Bag in front, steady step, nothing alarming. He tapped his card at the right spot, at the right rhythm, and moved toward the back row, where the midday sun hadn't yet reached. Nearby, a child looked up from a phone. Its eyes stopped at the man's hand. Roughened knuckles, fingers straight and strong, more familiar with commands than keyboards. The child watched for a moment, then looked back down. No one stared. No one tried to start a conversation. Everything moved as if his presence belonged, needing no explanation. No proof. The bus pulled away. Through each turn and stretch of road, the engine blended with the wind and the everyday sounds of the city. No one knew the man's destination, and no one asked. But perhaps that absence of curiosity was what gave the journey its meaning. There was no one following him to verify his identity. No one is secretly taking photos to boast about accidentally running into Booker. All that remained was a passenger sitting upright, hand resting lightly on his bag, eyes on the window, as if waiting for the right moment to step off and keep living as part of this city. That day, the city had no breaking news, no polarizing statements, no viral clips. But at one ordinary bus stop, a man once handcuffed in the name of justice and another learning to wield authority through presence, not commands, shared a moment no system could record, yet etched deeply in the memory of anyone perceptive enough to witness it. And maybe it was the man's silence that confirmed him more than any resume ever could. He didn't need a title to be recognized, nor a backstory to be understood. The calm way he boarded, hand on his bag, the slight smile when greeted, these were enough to remind others that sometimes a person is acknowledged not for their past, but for how they quietly make others reconsider their own. The story didn't end with applause or a grand ceremony. It closed in silence, but the kind that carries weight. In the main hall of the Federal Police Academy, where only medals and prominent names once hung, there now stood a new stone wall. No names were placed on it, no portraits, no biographies, no honors. Just a single line etched in fine script, echoing like footsteps. Salute not the name. Salute the silence that made you look again. No explanation was offered. No plaques, no guides, but strangely, everyone who passed by, from young cadets on their first internship to seasoned commanders who'd seen combat, slowed their pace before that wall, as if they knew the message wasn't about status, but the ability to recognize what one had once overlooked. A simple act, stopping to reconsider, had become a new measure of maturity in public service. From Miles Booker's story, much had changed. Not necessarily in law, nor entirely in curriculum, but in awareness. A black soldier once handcuffed on a street corner for simply waiting for a bus, without protest, without fury, forced an entire system to reevaluate how it made decisions. Officers rewrote behavior reports. Schools introduced classes on power reflex and the right to be ordinary. The shift didn't come through revolution, but through a string of small choices made by individuals. The biggest lesson was this: justice doesn't always begin with an accusation. Sometimes it starts with an unclouded look, and courage isn't always loud confrontation, it can be a quiet steadiness, unshaken by wrong. Booker didn't rebut or explain. His presence, calm, firm, without pleading or bitterness, compelled people to question their reflexes. That's when real change begins. When a system stops seeing silence as submission and starts hearing it as a mirror to its authority. In a world crowded with noise, outrage, and ego, this story leaves behind another option: to stand still without retreating, to be silent without surrendering, to forgive without forgetting. That choice is what made Booker a symbol, not because he stood above others, but because he didn't let anger pull him down to the level of what he stood against. Today, the details of his arrest, the testimony, and the trending hashtags may fade, but what lingers is a quiet ripple. Young officers pausing before acting, law students rethinking reasonable suspicion, and ordinary people looking a little closer before they judge. And all of it began not with a shout, but with someone who chose to be silent so that silence could make society look again. If there's one thing to remember from this story, it's this: change doesn't always start with power or fame. Sometimes it begins with a simple act, standing still, looking again, and refusing to be the one who turns away. And when enough people choose that, justice stops being a slogan and becomes a habit, quietly built, day by day. If you think justice begins with the strike of a judge's gavel, then you haven't yet understood how it truly starts. It begins when someone chooses not to respond with anger, not to demand protection, but simply stands tall, forcing those around them to lower their heads in shame. Miles Booker didn't claim glory. He reclaimed something simpler: the right to exist without being treated as a threat. And in this world, sometimes that alone is a revolution. So if you've ever stood still in the face of something wrong, ask yourself this: did you look or did you turn away? Just like every other time.